Well, welcome back to Variant Quran. I'm Daniel Brubaker, and I'm very pleased today to be able to break my silence and announce the completion and publication of my next book project. And I know that it's been somewhat of a mystery to many of you for quite some time, but this past week is now published. I want to take this video to explain what it is, why I wrote it, what it contains, and just to help all of you. It's on a different topic than the topic of this channel and the topic, obviously, of my earlier book, the Corrections in Early Quran Manuscripts. This is my area of academic expertise and focus, scholarly research, and so forth, and there's much, much more that I have to write and to publish and to bring to fruition on that, and some of those things have been in process even as I've been working on this project. However, something happened in the United States in 2020 that I just felt, as an American citizen, as somebody who's alive at this moment in time, I just felt called to focus my attention on that and to deal with this for a season, hopefully to make a difference, a positive difference in the direction that our country is going. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few minutes, just to help you understand what it is that I did, why I did it, and what is the content of this book. But the book that is published is now up on Amazon. It is called By the People: The 2020 U.S. Presidential Election and Theft of Americans' Right to Self-Rule. So this book is available in paperback and hardcover, and also on Kindle now. It should be available in every country, pretty much around the world. So wherever you are, you may be outside the United States, and so you may or may not have that much interest in what happens in the United States and our politics and so forth. However, I do believe that this issue and the things that are going on right now are of concern that is greater than merely American people. It does affect people around the world, because all these things are interconnected these days. My concern in the book, many books, of course, and other materials have been written and published on the topic of the 2020 election. Many of them, maybe even most of them, focus on questions of fraud in the election, and understandably so. I believe there was fraud in the election. I believe that it probably was significant. I think that the evidence is pointing in that direction heavily. However, in my book, I chose not to center fraud as the main focus of my discussion. So I focus rather on some much more fundamental core issues constitutionally and legally. The book is long. It's almost 500 pages. It's over 200,000 words. So even the print is actually fairly small in the book. And even at that page number, it's got about 800 footnotes, extensive bibliography. So it's not like many of the other things that you've seen written. If you have looked at the books on this topic, many of them that exist so far are written, I would say, by people in many cases who have direct experience, who are experts in the area, but they've been written somewhat in haste. Sometimes are poorly edited and really could benefit from a little bit more discipline applied to the book. That's not to discredit things that are published in that way by any means. I had to reference them myself in my research for the book a lot and sort of sift through that material. But I just want to mention that my book is different. I've been careful with it. It's well formatted. It is professional. It's, I believe, to a high academic standard. I did have to reference sources that are on both sides of the issue that are sometimes not fully credible. But I tried to also sift through those things and to get to the bottom of what's been happening. So 500 pages, about 800 footnotes, a lot of stuff. I'm working on getting an index in there, but because of the time sensitivity of the book, I really wanted to get it out, and I'll add the index. It will be added in short order as soon as I can get that done. But the other thing that I did with it is I added a study guide. So each chapter has questions, a set of 3, and in a couple of cases 4 questions at the end of the chapter that will be useful to, for example, book reading groups, study groups, students in school, and others, or even just for private study, to help spur engagement with the content of, with the topic of the book and with the content of the book. So that was just a little thing that I found helpful in other books that I've read over the years, and I just wanted to add it in because I want this to be a very useful book for everyone. All right, so what did I do in this book? I want to talk in a few minutes about some things related to the topic of the channel, so particularly response to Dr. Altıkulaç, which I will make some substantive remarks on that at the end of the video. So if you're interested in that and interested in the topic of the channel, please stick around. All right. Well, in this book, what I did is I first of all, why did I write it? I wrote it because going through the 2020 election on November 3rd, the period following of 2 months, watching everything that happened on January 6th, and then the inauguration on January 20th, the very quick, anointing of Biden and Harris about a week after the election, or less than a week after the election, and the very quick resolution of what clearly was not a resolved matter, but the very quick falling in line of all the forces in society, the media and academia and government and everything, to say that this was not only was the election over, but that it was completely unquestionable and safe and secure, and most incredibly safe and secure election in U.S. history, which in retrospect, and actually having done all this research, absolutely was not the case. This is probably one of the most flawed elections, if not the most flawed election in U.S. history. It's becoming quite evident. And you will understand that once you've read my book. But I just became indignant. I knew that things were wrong. I had seen the constitutional issues that were brought up that were very serious and very fundamental constitutional issues that the courts again and again and again ducked and dismissed on procedural grounds rather than on substantive grounds. And so they just are standing as unresolved issues, and they were so fundamental that they resulted in, I believe, a false election result in this case. But I don't want to get ahead of myself on that. That's why I wrote the book. I felt it was important to spend time really drilling down on this and doing it properly. We have a certain number of years in life, and we can spend them on things that are hopefully that are important. I spent more than a decade now doing the research on Quran manuscripts and writing in that area, traveling around the world, getting access to different institutions, looking at the manuscripts, taking photographs, and documenting those things. And I believe that is important, and I'm happy and gratified to see that my book on that topic has gotten so much discussion and is continuing to generate such lively discourse. That is very satisfying to me as an author, because I want to contribute to real live questions. This question of the U.S. election is another real live question. It's something that is affecting a lot of people, and that is very consequential for the world. All right, so I'm going to just read to you a couple things from the book, and I think the last one that this is from what I focused on the book is, I'm going to just put up the table of contents here for you so you can see. I've got 14 chapters. The last several are actually quite short, but I have a preface where I explain my my reasons for doing this, an introduction sort of laying out the lay of the land, and then we go into the reasons that something's not right. That's a chapter where I talk about the indications that something was going wrong, both before, during, and shortly after the election. What were the indications that there were problems and that there was good reason to question and to audit these things and to look into them. Second, I go into the suppression of news and information. This chapter is really interesting, and it was interesting for me to write, and I think you will find it interesting to read, because I went into the to the Google, to the Wikipedia, to the Facebook, Twitter, and I talked about all those things. We've seen a lot in the news about Twitter censoring, opinions and or allegedly doing so, and Facebook putting up all their warnings about things that viewpoints that they don't seem to like, and not putting up the warnings on viewpoints that they do favor, and things like that. Wikipedia, Wikipedia was one of the most remarkable ones to me. I have a discussion thanks to a gentleman named Stephen Crowder, who did an experiment with Wikipedia to sort of quantify or test whether there was a perspective bias in Wikipedia that is systemic. And I believe he demonstrated quite well that there is, and it's actually quite stunning as you read these things. So obviously, how information flows and or is prevented from flowing in society has a huge effect on the direction, and governments and political parties and political candidates have tremendous interest in the suppression or guiding of the flow of information. And I think it becomes quite evident as you read that chapter that it's not, often you hear people talking about it, but I think that I've done a good job of organizing and presenting what the real problem is, so that you can very clearly see what is going on. The next chapter is chapter 3, and this is the core of the entire argument of my book. It is focused on the Texas versus Pennsylvania. Texas and a few states sued Pennsylvania and 3 other states in 2020 in very early December, very strongly focused on the constitutional issues, 3 particular constitutional violations that were going on. The heart of it is who has the authority to make the rules for elections or to change the laws for elections. Constitution is quite clear on that, and in 2020, people other than the state legislatures, who have what's called plenary authority, which means complete authority to set election rules, they were overridden by other people aligned with the Democratic Party, and they made massive changes to the election rules in many U.S. states that affected the outcome of the election. And those changes were not legal. And so you will understand the Texas lawsuit was very well written. It wasn't without flaw, but it was very well written. And I stick fairly close to the argument of the lawsuit, and I quote it extensively in this chapter, but also I discuss it and try to make it clear to readers exactly what the problem was that was being presented, and so that you can understand what was going on. Unfortunately, the Texas lawsuit, as many of the other lawsuits, was dismissed by the Supreme Court, and other lawsuits were dismissed by the Supreme Court or lower courts, not on the substance of the matter. The court did not rule on the substance of the matter. In fact, the court seemed to acknowledge that there were serious constitutional questions here, and they dismissed it without comment for lack of standing, which is a technicality. And it's really unfortunate that they did so, as I think you will understand if you read the book. It seems that they just did not want to disrupt the country by weighing in on this matter, certainly because I think they saw clearly that if they had looked at the actual merits of the lawsuit, they knew which way it would have had to go. And that would have been to undo the election results in several U.S. states, and that would have put the election back over to Donald Trump. And, at the time, people were threatening riots and violence and all kinds of different things for that. But really what happened in the end is shenanigans that were illegal were allowed to stand, and people who broke the rules were allowed to get away with it and get their candidate across the finish line and into the White House. All right, so that's chapter 3, and that's now we've gotten past the whole heart of the book, and we're able to move on to the more fun and interesting stuff. Actually, that's kind of fun to me in terms of it's all very interesting. My wife read this book over the weekend. She's almost finished with it now. She hasn't really read it as I've been writing it, and it's been really difficult for me to pry her away from it. I've heard that from some other people who are reading it now. Another wife of a friend who's reading it said, I can't get it away from him to read it. So people are finding it very interesting and compelling, and I think you will too. But the next chapter after chapter 3, where I talk about the Texas lawsuit, is the chapter where I deal with fraud. Now, as I already mentioned, fraud is not the focus of my argument, but of course, it does need to be, it's something that many people are talking about. It's something that I believe did happen. It's something that does happen in every election. I believe its scale was much greater in the 2020 election because of the tremendous opportunities that were introduced by the actions of those parties that I already mentioned. But again, I'm not resting my argument on the fraud issue, but I do discuss it in chapter 4. So after those things, I go into a couple of chapters where I deal with the more historical issues. And one thing I did is I spent a good amount of time really doing history and writing a history of what happened before 2020, what happened after 2020. The next chapter is called Background and Consequences, where I talk about what happened before the year, leading up to the year, and what happened as a consequence of the events as they unfolded in the 2020 election. And the consequences in some cases in many cases are quite grim, both for the United States and for the world. We saw, for example, the disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the result of that, which was utterly incompetent and, of course, would not have happened that way, I expect, had the election been properly adjudicated and the people's voice had been heard. That's only one example. So there are many other things I talk about there. And then that leads into the next chapter, chapter 6, which is overview of the year. So an overview of the year, I go through all the things that happened in 2020. As I went through it and I was writing this chapter, it was only a year later, but I was really surprised at how much really happened during that year. Of course, we had COVID-19 and all the other events that took place during the year, but there was so much else that occurred. And so in a way, it was kind of a fun trip down the recent memory, and it was also helpful to me to organize all this information and to sort of see how the things connected together and played into the larger issue of the election, which I'm dealing with. And I deal, especially in the chapter, I give a great deal of focus to two particular topics. Those two topics are the COVID-19, which occurred during 2020, as we all know, and the way that happened, but also the way it was used in the U.S. election as an excuse, as a pretext for doing things in the name of emergency that are not allowed to be done under the Constitution or the existing laws. And the second thing, of course, is was the Black Lives Matter protests and issues, George Floyd and other people who, the shooting of Jacob Blake and Breonna Taylor and others, Ahmaud Arbery and others. And so I talk about those things and how they played out. I try to give a detailed and careful history of what happened in each one of those cases, and also to talk about how these things came to bear on the election itself, which is, of course, the topic of the book. And then I hit on a couple of other issues in the year, but really the focus of attention is on those two main ones in the bulk of that chapter. All right, so after the overview of the year, I go into the crucial period. We've got the 2020 year overall, but I kind of stop at the end of that chapter at the election itself, and then I leave the election and the remainder of the year for another chapter, which is November 3rd through January 6th. And in this chapter, I give a timeline of the key events that happened during that time period. I lay out the sort of election night, what happened then, the day after the election, the process of declaring Biden and Harris to have been victorious, which happened on the 7th. The election was called by the Associated Press just a little bit before noon on Saturday the 7th. And then, of course, the flurry of lawsuits that were filed and so forth. Now, many of you may have heard that all the lawsuits were decided against Donald Trump, and it has been ruled, and he failed in every case. I was really surprised when I went and actually looked at this. What you just heard is something that has been put forward by the Democrat Party, and in particular has been spread around by a lawyer for the Democrat Party who has been responsible for many of the hoaxes and scandals of the Democratic Party, including the Russia collusion scandal, which was the Democrats' attempt to overturn the 2016 election that stretched on and came out to be based on really nothing. And so Mark Elias, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, was the lawyer who was really driving that. Well, he's also the one who was driving this by Twitter, this talking point that all the election lawsuits were lost by Trump. It's not true, but it was said, it was tweeted by him, and it has been spread around, and many people think, when they think of the election, they think, oh, Trump lost all those lawsuits. Actually, of the just short of 100 lawsuits that were filed by Trump or his supporters, or against Trump, or against his supporters, the Republican National Committee, only 30 of them were decided so far, according to the numbers as of the time that I wrote the book, to my understanding, were actually decided on the merits of the case, meaning the substance of what was being argued. All the rest of the cases were dismissed on technicalities like standing or timeliness or other details. It was moot. So it's really important to understand that the great bulk of the lawsuits didn't go against Trump. Trump was not able to get a hearing because the court said, well, on this technical issue, you don't have the right to stand. And actually, some of those rulings were pretty contrived in my view. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but in my observation, they were either, in some cases, possibly political decisions, but in other cases, cowardly decisions, I think, by the courts, or misapplication of the principles that were being used to dismiss the cases. Standing and the emblem, the really crown jewel of the whole thing, again, is the Texas lawsuit. And many of the other lawsuits made the similar arguments that the Texas lawsuit was. But the Texas lawsuit was the one that most people thought, well, this is the one. This is the one that's going to, that's going to turn the tide in this and is really going to make the difference. And, well, as I've looked at it, I think, well, it should have. The issue of standing was used in that, and it really, from what I have heard and from what I've seen, and I think they're right, there's probably no clearer situation of standing than when you have 5 states sue 4 states in an issue involving the election and the Constitution. No one else would really have standing in that situation. The suing states in that lawsuit did not have standing to bring the suit, then nobody would. And there's a really big open question whether those constitutional issues can ever really be heard and addressed. And there has to be a way to hear and address those issues. All right, so most of the lawsuits that were filed in 2020 were dismissed on technicalities, not on the merits. Now, on the ones that were heard on the merits, and this is where it also gets interesting, only 8 of them were decided in favor of Biden and Harris and the DNC. 22 of them went in favor of Trump or the Republican National Committee. So I will say that again. The majority, almost 2/3 of the cases that were decided on the merits, went against Biden and Harris and the DNC and in favor of Donald Trump. That's a pretty strong winning streak. And also considering that the other cases that were dismissed on technicalities, I believe Trump would have prevailed in the great majority of those. We don't know at this point because they were never heard. Okay, so that is the chapter dealing with the November 3rd through January 6th. And of course, other things happened in that time, especially the January 6th. And I do talk about the events of January 6th, both in the introduction, possibly in the preface, but also in this chapter as well as another legal theory that came up related to the Electoral Count Act, which was passed in 1887. It has been a law of the United States since 1887. I quote it in its entirety. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not making an argument for it, but I try to help readers. So if you read this book, I'm trying to help you understand what it was that the law says, what it was that was being argued, and some people have said that the law is unconstitutional. A very respected constitutional lawyer, Rob Nadelson, has said that he believes the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional. And I talk about why he says that in the book as well. But the fact of the matter is that the Electoral Count Act is the law of the land. It has been the law of the land for almost 150 years. And moreover, it has been applied a number of times successfully in election situations. Therefore, until it is successfully challenged and overturned, it's not fair to say, well, you can't apply it because it's not constitutional, because we don't like what you're applying it for, but other people can apply it if they want to. That's not justice. You have to go by the laws of the land. The next chapter is chapter 8, and it's called A Written Confession. Now, with my early readers, I have found that when they reach this chapter, they find it to be probably the most mind-blowing and compelling chapter in many ways. There was an article that was published by a person named Molly Ball in Time magazine, and it was published just a few days after everything was said and done in January of 2021. And basically, what Molly Ball does is she lays out the whole thing. First of all, she says, yes, there was a conspiracy to defeat Donald Trump. Yes, it was done by all these people that you said it was done. Basically, Trump was right. He was right on the money when he said there was a conspiracy and that it was rigged and so forth. And she says, and here's what happened. And so she lays it out, and she tells all the people involved. She tells what happened. She tells about Zuckerberg and Facebook, and the manipulation of media and the coalition of all these different interests, not only to interfere with the process of the election, but also to create this popular impression. They had a plan to create this declaration of a winner so that there would be this impression that differed from reality, but yet pushed everything over the edge. And so many of the things that she talks about in the article are probably illegal. People should go to jail and be prosecuted for them. Election law is pretty strict about what can be done and about how finances can be used in elections. And so I think that you'll find that chapter to be chapter 8. It's not a very long chapter, but it's quite an interesting discussion of Molly Ball's article. I include in that some discussion of the mail-in ballots, why they are illegal in many countries, in most countries, why they are a known security risk, and they're one of the most prone to fraud and manipulation. John Lott has statistics on that I mentioned in there. So that is chapter 8, A Written Confession. Okay, the next chapter is denial of requests for investigation or redress. And in this chapter, what I actually do is I go through all those lawsuits one by one. And among other things, I detail in very quick summary what each lawsuit, when it was filed, what it was about, what was the outcome, and I categorize them by whether who prevailed, whether the Biden and the DNC prevailed, whether Trump and the Republican National Committee prevailed, or whether they were dismissed on a technicality. And so that will be very useful for reference. I hope I got everything right. I'm not, as I said, I'm not a lawyer. I was referencing materials that were prepared by others, including Stanford University and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, election tracker. But I think I got it right, and I think that you'll find it to be a very useful resource if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And also, once the index is in, you can flip through and reference it. It doesn't need to be that you read all the way through. All right, and then after that, it's just the concluding material of the book. I talk about why the result was false. I do a quick chapter after that details the second quick impeachment of Donald Trump in January of 2021 and February of 2021. And at that point in the book, I placed it there so that readers would have a real sense of the highly political nature of that impeachment and why it was also an unjust. It's impeachment, by the way, is not a legal process. It's a political process. It's always a political process, but it was a highly political impeachment, and they did it very quickly before they had opportunity to call and do any sort of real investigation into the allegations that were against him. One of the main statements made in the articles of impeachment that time was that President Trump refused to accept the results of the election. So think about that for a moment. President Trump had not refused to leave the White House, but he did refuse to concede the election, and he did not attend the inauguration of Joe Biden, and he still has not conceded the election. And so, and because he does not believe that he lost the election. Now, is it a crime to not accept that you lost an election when you believe that you actually did not lose an election? No, it's not. It's not a crime to believe that. It's not a crime to say that. And so it is really interesting that they put that very prominently in the front of their articles of impeachment, because Democrats were really presenting it at the time as though it is the crime of the century to raise any sort of question about the results of this election. And if you read the Molly Ball article, and she, by the way, it becomes very quickly evident as you read her article, is a hardcore Democrat partisan. If you read that, you'll understand exactly why that narrative existed and why it was around and why it was also just contrived. It was a political narrative. It wasn't driven by reality in the actual world. All right, so that's the second impeachment of Donald Trump, and then I go through the conclusion, why this happened in 2020. I talk about a conclusion, and then in the final chapter, chapter 14, I talk about what now? What do we do from here? What are some steps that Americans can take? I lay this out for Americans, but these principles of self-government are principles that are really they're rooted in human rights, natural rights, God-given rights, which are affirmed in our Constitution. The existence of natural rights given by God is what made way for the abolition of our pre-existing condition of slavery as a nation. Once that was affirmed in our founding political document, it became very difficult. It did take 89 years until the abolition of slavery, but it became morally and legally untenable to perpetuate the institution of slavery because of the affirmation that all men are created equal, meaning all men and women, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so these ideas rest upon the idea that we can govern ourselves and not be ruled over by people who are placed themselves into power is really rooted in this idea of human rights. And so those principles apply to all of humanity. They are implemented in different ways in different countries, but it's really important, I believe, it's important for the world. And what happened in the United States in 1776 and 1789 when our Constitution was adopted was consequential as an experiment in liberty. And what can happen when you adopt these principles of liberty and self-governance, and principles like all men are created equal and endowed with certain individual rights that governments really have no right to take away? What can happen? So bringing this all right back around, what I'm talking about in this book is Really, I wrote it to be persuasive. I wrote it so that people would understand. It's really hard, even as I'm doing research on the book, it was very difficult to even get to details of what had happened in many cases, because even when you know what you're looking for these days on a Google search or a search engine search or in other places, it's more and more difficult to even find things that you know are out there. And so I wanted to put something down on paper for the record, a historical accounting of the year, a historical journal of the year and what had happened. So I hope I've done that successfully. I think that you will enjoy it. If you buy it, I've tried to price it reasonably. All those pages, they do drive up the price a little bit, so sorry about that. I am working on an abridged version, which will be somewhere in the realm of maybe 150 pages, so much more modest. But if you want all the footnotes and sources and the full development, I think that you'll find this to be a real useful reference for a good deal of time to come. And I do hope that this book becomes one of the sort of defining books on the topic. Right now, many things that are out there are either poorly edited or carelessly written and things like that. Again, not to fault them, but I think that you'll find that this is a different thing altogether. All right, so that is that. I want to ask all of you, first of all, I should have done this at the start, but I first of all wanted to say thank you again to all of you who have given support to me throughout this time and even before that, through comments on my YouTube channel, on this YouTube channel, and some of you who have given financially as donations either through Patreon or through my website, where you can give. If you're in the United States, you can give with a tax-deductible gift. So along that line, I want to emphasize, and I stated at the beginning of this book is not an argument in favor of any one political party or candidate. It is an argument, as I think will become quite evident as you look through, it is an argument for fair elections and for a process and for a preservation of a process that allows the people's voice to be heard and expressed in government. In this case, I do have a strong impression of who the rightful winner should have been, and in fact was, if the processes were followed the way they ought to have been. So that is that book. So thank you to all of you who have helped me, and I ask that you consider continuing to do so, and others who may wish to join. You can go to danielbrubaker.com. The site is currently under construction, but this video will be up for a while. So if you go there, you can see what I'm up to. You can see the various publications and about me, but you can also click on a link to donate to me, either one time or ongoing. So I do appreciate that. All right, concerning the book, I wanted to mention a couple things. First of all, if all of you who are watching this video, if you haven't been convinced already, I do hope, and this is my straightforward request, that if you are able, and if you're in a country where it's reasonable to do so, but particularly if you're in the United States, I ask that you consider buying this book. Buying the book, and by the way, I think the paperback edition is the best of the various editions, but it also is available in Kindle and in hardcover. But buying the book helps to elevate it in the rankings so that it becomes visible to more people. And I really believe that this book is timely and it needs to be visible to a lot of people. So buying the book is number one. Number two, if you could leave after you get it and read it, if you could leave a comment and a rating of the book on Amazon. Number three, if you could tell friends about it, that would be great. And number 4 and 5, if you have connections to people in media, or maybe you are yourself involved in media, I would be happy to come on television shows or radio shows and talk about this book. And so if you can arrange an invitation for me to do that, that would be wonderful. And finally, if you are involved in, it's a time I've found in our country where a lot of people are learning the logic of the United States Constitution, why its principles are really of benefit to everyone, and they really serve a wonderful purpose of allowing people to live freely and to prosper, and for achievement to be rewarded in a fair and just way, and for justice to prevail. So if you are involved in a study group, reading this book would be a great thing to do with a group of 4, 5, 6, 10 friends, and reading it chapter by chapter, and then meeting together and talking about the study questions. It would be a great thing to put in front of students if you have, probably it would be difficult for elementary level students, but if you have high school students, it would be a great thing to have them read a chapter or two and deal with the study questions or talk about the materials, maybe alongside other, perspectives on the matter. That's great. It's good to hear various perspectives. And now I want to transition and get back to something relating to the topic of this channel, which is variant Quran. I was at a conference in Germany several months ago. I recorded some interviews with various people, a very nice interview with Dr. Gerd Puyn in his home. I have an interview with Ibn Warraq. I have interviews with a couple other people who I found very interesting, who presented papers at that conference, working on other materials, other books, the other book related to the one very interesting Quran manuscript. So that will come out hopefully soon. I hope you can understand why I prioritized this book to put it ahead of the other projects. And there is, by the way, there is one more political political philosophy book that's in the pipeline. So that's kind of vying for attention, not on this issue, on another issue, but in the related subject matter. So yeah, and that leaves us with a response to Dr. Altıkulaç. Now, I have seen that his book has gone into paperback as well. The hardcover was the one that I originally received and did the unboxing here on this channel. And in fact, I was very pleased with the fact that he had made the response, even though it is a refutation, supposedly, of my book, and was very critical. I was very pleased and honored to get that, and I remain so. Every time I think about it, I think what a privilege to have one's very first book be taken so seriously by people who are operating at the highest levels in one's field. So I'm grateful. I continue to be grateful for that, and for the criticism that was published in the University of Chicago Journal by Haitham Sidki. Even though he's outside the field, he has a certain level of high technical engagement with the topic and is becoming more involved in the field. So he wrote a critical article critical of my book, and it had some flaws with it that I believed were serious. And so I dealt with those in my own response. But that all to say, I have this sort of ongoing engagement in the world, and I see that people are continuing to talk about my book. And by the way, the Amharic translation, I got word the day before yesterday that the translation is complete. And so we will be getting that typeset and ready for publication. I don't know how much time that will take, but it's good news to know that is done. I still need a translation into Spanish. So if any of you watching this know someone who is competent to, not only in Spanish, to translate to Spanish, but also in the general technical nature of the book to make such a translation, please refer them to me. So coming back to Dr. Altıkulaç, I owe you all a somewhat more of a substantial response to his book. And so hopefully I can get to that now. We're going on an hour for this video, so thank you for hanging around. So what did he do in his book, which was the refutation of Daniel Allen Brubaker's corrections in early Quran manuscripts? Hold on, I'll get the book for you and show it to you. All right, so this is the book that he wrote, and again, he did actually what was the natural thing to do, and that is he went through every single one of my corrections that I present in my corrections in early Quran manuscripts. It's the German edition, but you can see it there. So for every single one of these corrections, he went through and found, and probably he had other people helping him, I assume, research assistants, but he located and presents other manuscripts that are of similar time or earlier than the ones that I show in my book, and he displays that section of text where the Rasam aligns with the currently accepted Rasam of the Quran. Now, so the argument that he's making there is that because the expected Rasam exists in contemporary or earlier manuscripts, therefore the ones that I present in my book, and by the way, my 20 are only 20 examples out of thousands so far. So he's suggesting that because they exist in contemporary or earlier manuscripts, that therefore these must be owing to a mistake that the scribe made. So in order to give an answer to that contention, which I believe I'm representing right what he is saying there, and believe it or not, I actually still have not read his book completely. I've gotten the gist of it. I've flipped through it and looked at what he has done in it, and it's pretty clear and easy to see what is being presented there. What he's arguing there is not anything that I've ever suggested is not the case. There's always the possibility that any given correction is merely correcting a mistake and nothing more. But on the back side of that, it is not, I believe, sound to say that because another contemporary manuscript or even indeed earlier manuscripts or even multiple earlier manuscripts contain the standard text, that therefore the deviation that's observed in the particular manuscript is necessarily a scribal error. It may be so. And the existence in other manuscripts, as we've said, would be a bit of evidence in favor of accepting that it would be attributable to scribal error. But there are also scenarios that we could imagine that are viable in which it could be something other than scribal error. And among these would be, the idea that there is an alternate tradition somewhere and that the variant that we see represents some alternate understanding of what the written Rasam should be in that particular spot. And so obviously an argument like that would be strengthened by more than one manuscript that has the particular deviation contained within it. And so this research is of looking through the various early manuscripts. That should be one of the tasks, is looking for those sort of patterns in multiple manuscripts, I think. Now, so just going back to the idea that he calls this a refutation, one of the interesting things is that he's really refuting something that I never said in the first place. I present my opinion that they are, in some cases, something other than scribal error. And I think that's a very different thing from making a bold and categorical statement that the Quran was changed. It's really, first of all, it's overly simplistic, because if you have multiple traditions that eventually at some point in time, one tradition winds up prevailing, that, does that mean that the Quran has been changed? Well, maybe or maybe not. It could mean that out of several traditions vying for each other, one just prevailed. And so, and I'm not developing that theory here either. I'm just presenting the different scenarios. So I was very cautious. Many of you, actually, my book continues to sell. The Corrections in Early Quran Manuscripts continues to sell quite well around the world. And so those of you who have read it will see that I'm pretty careful in how I make my conclusions and how I don't make my conclusions in that book. And more conclusions will be coming in more academic books that are coming out. But I just wanted to engage his book and say, first of all, what he did was the logical next step, and it's what I have suggested doing in the past and what I would have done and will continue to do as I have opportunity, is to compare these things side by side. And so there's no fault with doing that. It's natural. It's not as though, oh my goodness, I never thought of doing that, and somebody got me and so forth. he did a very logical thing, and I think that is to be commended. So what more can I say about that? I haven't really looked at each of the manuscripts, but generally he's dating them, he's looking at the general way of placing them in time based upon the script style and probably where available radiocarbon dating, although in many of these cases radiocarbon dating is not available. But the various features of the manuscript give you a sort of a time period, or at least a relative time period of when they were produced. All right, yeah, there's probably more that could be said about that. But there you have it. That's my video response to Altıkulaç's book, The Refutation, and you can buy that if you're interested in seeing The Refutation. It's still a little bit expensive, but I think you can get it in the United States, and then you can obviously continue to get my book in both black and white and full color editions in both English and German, and very soon in Amharic as well, and hopefully at some point in French and Spanish. And there's another language. Oh yes, Arabic. Arabic is being worked on. So I haven't heard an update from that team who's doing that, but Arabic will be out sometime soon. So thank you very much for your patience in watching this very long video. I hope you all are doing very well, and appreciate you. I have not disappeared off the face of the earth. I am here, and I'm glad to be back with you now. So hopefully I'll be putting out videos on a more regular basis going forward. Thank you.